Our theme for this year is loving to tell the story. And as we've been looking at over the past several months, there's a lot of occasions in the life of Christ that teach some very important lessons. This morning is no different. And it's going to teach us some things about what's actually in the heart of our Savior, what is in the heart of God. What does that look like? And how can we share that with others? This may be one of the stories that you love to tell about Jesus. And I hope that after this morning, it'll be one that you love to tell even more. It's one that's probably well known to us when Jesus takes off his outer garments, girds himself with a towel, kneels down with some water, and begins to wash the feet of the 12 disciples that are there, including Judas. And in that, we see a very stark contrast between Jesus, who is the servant of all, as opposed to the disciples who just days earlier were arguing about which one was the greatest. And so that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. There's a account that is told of a woman and a young man that married many, many years ago. And they were married for only a short period of time when war broke out. And the young man was going to be drafted to go overseas in the war. And he told his wife, his young bride, that if something were to happen to me, if I were to die over there, I want you to remarry. And the woman refused that, saying, no, you're my husband. I've pledged my life to you. I would never marry another person. You are my husband. You're my soulmate. Well, he went off to war, and as happened for many people, he was missing in action. And so for the next decades, she waited for him to come back home, hoping and trusting that maybe one day he would. So much so that each year she would go about changing the outside of the house because she knew how much he really liked to have the yard mowed and looking a certain way. And so every year she would change that to make sure that he was able to come back and see something new. Well, 61 years later, he did come back. That they had found his body, they had identified it, and sent him back. And that woman, for that 61 years, stayed devoted to that man that she had married and said that I will be yours and yours alone. She loved him to the end. And so when you think about what we're going to be looking at this morning, there's some very deep-rooted concepts that are involved in just that one simple statement, and how that statement is played out in the life of Jesus at this particular moment of time. And so this morning, we're only going to have two key words. So if you're ready for those two key words, hold your notebooks up real high. All right, very good. Only one of them's on the screen. Loved. I'm sorry, not loved. We're going to talk about love. End is the word. End, which means the final moment, is what we're going to be looking at. So end is one of those words. The other word is utmost. That means to the fullest extent. Because here in John 13, where it says that he loved them to the end, I believe that's what it's talking about when it uses that word to the end, is that he loved them to the final moment, but he also loves them to the utmost. It is real easy for us to get distracted by things of life. There's so much going on. There's so many things that vie for our attention that we lose sight of the things that are most important, the things that we should be doing. And with Jesus, on this particular evening, what was Jesus thinking about? Jesus knew that his time had come. Jesus knew that his death was going to be not very long, a matter of hours. He knew the beating he was about to take. He knew the spit that was going to fly into his face. He knew the slaps and the scourging. He knew the crucifixion. He knew all of those things, and he knew that it was only a few hours away. And yet Jesus was still not distracted from what was needed at that moment of time. And in that moment of time, what his disciples needed was an example of who God really is. And so as we look through John 13, I want us to keep in mind those two things, loving him to the end and loving him also to the utmost. Because at this particular moment of time, John gives us insight into the mind and the emotions of Jesus as he's approaching his death. And from this, we see in very practical terms what it means to be a servant and to love to the end like Jesus did and to follow his example. The words that are used here are very, very beautiful, and they're moving, especially when you consider, as it says, that Judas was also one of them. Not only did Jesus know what was going to happen, but he knew who was there at the table with him. He knew that Judas was there, that Satan had already put it into Judas's heart. Judas had already decided. He had allowed for this temptation that Satan had been giving, and he'd given himself over to it, was going to betray him before the night was over with. And he was going to do it with a kiss. He also knew that Peter was there. And Peter, who has already said before and is going to say again this very night, even if all of us have to die, I am willing for that to happen. I am willing to go with you till death. And he knew that Peter was going to deny him before the night was over. He knew that his disciples, who all said the same thing, were all going to be scattered because they were afraid of being arrested and what might happen. And this was not according to the plans that they had in mind. Jesus knew all of those things. Jesus knew that all things had been given into his hands by the Father. Jesus knew that he had all authority, that Jesus knew that he was going to be the head over all things to the church. Yet Jesus is the one who created all things, and it was created for him and by him, and through him all these things exist. Jesus knew all of those things, and he was not distracted by any of it, because what was needed was for him to gird himself with a towel and get down on his knees and wash the feet of Peter, of Judas, and all of the rest of them. Very significant is this event, not just because of what it meant for them at that time, but also what it means for us. There's many occasions where Jesus has used this idea of being with them to the end, teaching them to observe all these things. This is what Jesus is saying as he tells his apostles that they're going to go into all the world and spread the gospel. Teach them to observe all things I've commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. That when Jesus is talking about loving and being with them to the end, this is one of the things he's talking about. Jesus has already been crucified. He's been resurrected. He's about to ascend back to the Father. And he tells his disciples, I'm going to be with you. And you remember from our class on Wednesday night, he had already warned many of his disciples, the 70, when he sent them out. I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. You're going to be hated by all men. People are going to persecute you and cause you to flee from one city to another city. You're going to be brought before kings and governors. They're going to persecute you. They're going to put you to death. But not to be afraid of any of these things, Jesus says, because I'm with you, even to the end of the age. And again, it's not just that Jesus is there to the final moment of things, but Jesus is with them to the utmost. When we think of Jesus being with us, it should not be just the idea that, yes, Jesus is there following along with me. He's kind of by my side. He's available to me along the way of life. And he'll be there until that moment of my death and then beyond. But along the way, he is with me to the utmost. Do we understand that? On this particular night, Jesus asked his disciples, do you understand? He even tells Peter, you don't understand. You don't know yet, but you will. Usually in our darkest moments, when things get very, very difficult, that's when we hopefully know. But even then, we may discover that we've never really known. Yes, he's there, he's available, but he hasn't really been with me to the end of all things. We have a passage like 1 Corinthians 1, verses 8 and 9, that speaks not to apostles, but to Christians in general. That who will also confirm you to the end, that you may be blameless in the day of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is faithful, by whom you were called into the fellowship of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And on this particular night, Jesus knew exactly what the cost of that love was going to be, what it was going to mean for him, and the price he was going to have to pay, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Jesus knew that the love that he had was going to come at a cost. To love to the end bears with it a tremendous amount of obligation. That if you're going to love someone to the end, that means that you are obligating, that you are commanding, and that you are giving over your life totally. And that everything within it is being given over. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. You see the way in which it is not just to the final moment, but to the utmost, and in a way that no man and no tongue could even describe. It's interesting that when you go through the book of John, and it's not surprising, though, really, that the word love is used so many times. Love is used 26 times in John. Loved is used 23 times. Loves is used 8 times. And 46 of those times are used from chapter 13 to chapter 21, which is talking about Jesus' last moments. Up until that point in John, the thing that you read about many times, love is there in various forms, obviously, but one of the things that is very prominent in those chapters is the word knowing. Knowing who Jesus is, knowing what he came to do. And even when you hear in 1 John chapter 13, you see this over and over again as well. John has this way of using these deeper meanings and contrasting things back and forth. But here we see that John is pointing to Jesus' love being for two very important reasons. Notice again what it was about. Verse 1 at the end, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And then in verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand and that he had come from God and was going to God. The two things that John uses to show why Jesus was motivated to show this type of love is that he loved his own. He loved them to the end. His love for others. But the second is knowing that he was going back to God. And that's the part I think we sometimes miss, is that Jesus did these things because he had an eternal relationship with his Father. And that's what is often overlooked in this account. If you notice how many times this idea of what Jesus knew is used, look in verse 1 once again. Jesus knew that his hour had come. In verse 3, knowing that the Father had given all into his hands, that he come from God, was going back to God. Later in verse 11 of Jesus, it said, for he knew who would betray him, therefore he said. Jesus knew all of these things, and because of his relationship with God, that he had come from God, was going back to God, he was able to not be distracted by the fact that he was about to be tortured to death. He was not distracted by the fact that he had all power, he had all authority, he was the one who needed to be served at that moment, but was willing to do the serving. It was based not only on his love for his apostles, but also because he knew of his relationship with his Father. When you look at the apostles in contrast, go back to verse 7. Or go to verse 7. Jesus answered and said to him, when Peter objects to Jesus washing his feet, what I am doing you do not understand, but you will know after this. In verse 12, so when he had washed their feet, taken his garments and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? In verse 17, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. And many other times in chapter 13, it says this as well. You see that these disciples are not understanding why Jesus is here. They don't understand what his love is about to demand of him. And they don't know about that eternal relationship with God that they should have. If they did, they would have been the ones who were fighting with one another to grab the towel instead of grabbing power. And that's what was missing here. Each was looking out for his own interests and not for the interests of Jesus at this particular occasion and time. We also have in John 15 and verse 9 that Jesus says, as the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. In verse 13 it says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one life for his friends. Again, Jesus says the same thing that he was showing here in John 13. He understands his love for his brethren, that no greater love has anyone than this, to lay down their life. But he also understood about his relationship with the Father. As I have been loved by the Father, this is the way that I have loved you as well. And that's what he was expecting from them. And because of that, not only was he loving them to the end, but he also served them to the end. Go back to verse 4 once again. Jesus rose from supper and laid aside his garment. He took a towel and girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel which he had girded himself. Then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew who would betray him. Therefore he said, you are not all clean. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garment, sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? When you see what is being exchanged between them here, you see that Jesus is taking a position of voluntary humility. And that voluntary humiliation that Jesus takes upon himself is something that should rebuke any pride and arrogance that we might have. that this is God in the flesh. And when John is revealing what God in the flesh is like, who is God? What does it mean that God is love? What does it mean that God is light, that God is holy, that God is pure, to be as He is? What does that mean? This is what it means. That you take a towel, you get on your knees, and you wash the feet of others. Jesus is not instituting some church ritual, but He is instituting a way of thinking, a way of acting, and a way of loving that is different than all of mankind. Jesus served them to the end. Jesus was there when He chose them. Jesus was there with them along the way of life. In John 1 and verse 18, it tells us that no one has seen God, the only God who's at the Father's side. He has made Him known. Everything that we need to know about who God is and what God's love really looks like is seen in this account. It is being portrayed in real time before them. Who is God? Well, He's at your feet serving you. That would make any of us uncomfortable. And so when He comes to Peter, and Peter is saying, "You'll never wash my feet," how many of us would feel the same way? I'm not deserving of this. I don't want you to belittle and put yourself to such a low state in life, something that not just the servant, but the least of all servants is supposed to be doing. And this is God who's down here washing my feet. God doesn't serve me, I serve God. It's not what Jesus is showing here. It's not what we remembered a few moments ago when we took of the bread and drank of the cup. Because Jesus did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give His life a ransom for many. It's the very purpose for which He came. These very disciples, in Mark chapter 10, verses 35 through 45, when you look at that account, that account is only a few days earlier than what we're reading. And there's an argument that arises about which one is the greatest. And the reason that it arises is because the mother of James and John come to Jesus and say, "Hey, I want my sons to sit by your side, one on the left and the other on the right." And you can imagine how the other disciples did not appreciate that at all. Because who are James and John, the sons of thunder, the ones that had to be rebuked for wanting to call down fire on all these other cities and nations? Why should they be sitting there? Shouldn't it be Peter? Because he's the one that said, to which it was said, he was the rock. Shouldn't it be John? Because of the love, not because of the hatred? There's all kinds of arguments that must have arisen between all of them. And Jesus has to rebuke them and remind them of what the Son of God does. It's interesting that when you go through Jesus rebuking His disciples, especially in these moments of pride and arrogance, that Jesus has to remind them about what true discipleship is. And He uses words like denying self. He uses words like being the least among you. He uses words like being humble, like a child. Those are the phrases that He chooses to use to talk about greatness. And so that's why you have this argument that's going on. And that's why in that room you had men fighting for power and not a towel. And when you're filled with a room of people who are fighting for power instead of a towel, it leaves you with bad hearts and stinky feet. And that's exactly what you see in this account. Of all the people, Jesus should have been the last one expected to do this, and yet He was the one who took the initiative in doing it. In 1 Timothy 2 and verse 6, Jesus did not deserve to die. Jesus is not the one who should have been offered up as a ransom. And yet it says He gave Himself a ransom for all. What it teaches us is that when Jesus is loving to the end, to the final moment, and to the utmost, that what you see is a Savior that is not willing to give up on you. You remember in Luke 15 that you have the story of the prodigal son. And just as it was when you had the man that lost the sheep, he goes out searching for it. The woman who loses the coin, she cleans the house searching everywhere for that coin. They're not willing to give up until they find that thing that is precious. That this prodigal son's father is there, and no doubt he is every day looking toward the horizon, hoping to see the figure of his son coming back home. And he doesn't give up on them. And even when his son does come back and begins to enunciate the confession that he had rehearsed, his father interrupts him, bringing the robe and the ring and the fatted calf and having a party to celebrate his son who was dead and is now alive again. Jesus is not willing to give up on us. He loves us to the end. He loves us to the final moment. He loves us to the fullest extent, giving himself as a ransom. And even now, loving us and serving us to the end, that he is able to save to the uttermost those who come to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. That even now when we go to God in prayer, even now when we go to him in our time of need and asking for deliverance, he is there to make intercession for us, to beg on our behalf, to grant us that strength that we need to make it through, because he loves us, and he loves us to the end. So some of the things that we see from this is when Jesus asked this question, do you know what I've done? Look at verse 12 once again. So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, do you know what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If then your Lord and teacher have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than him who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Do you know what I've done to you? Often what people say is, yes, you gave me an example. I'm supposed to get down and wash people's feet, and they make it into a ritual. And that's not at all what Jesus is teaching. Jesus is teaching, if I am your master, if I am your Lord, the one whose feet should be washed, because I am over you. I am greater than you. I am your teacher. I am your master. I am your Lord. But if I'm willing to do this to you, then shouldn't you do it to one another, since you're all equals? That none of you is better than the other? There is no one who is greatest among you? That if your master is willing to do this, you ought to be able to do these things to one another. And there's something else that I believe is written there as well. If you go to Philippians chapter 2, keep your finger there in John but also go to Philippians chapter 2. One of the things I believe that Jesus is teaching at this particular moment of time, that's there at least in symbols, is what Paul talks about to the Philippian brethren. Look at verse 5. Philippians 2, let's look at verse 5 first. Paul says, let this mind be in you which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. If then I am your master, if then I am your teacher. Verse 7, but made himself of no reputation. Jesus took off his outer garment. He took off his robe. The next thing he says is that not only did he make himself of no reputation, but he took the form of a bondservant. Jesus girded himself with a towel. And coming in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death. He looked like a servant. And Jesus became a servant to all. He is master, he is Lord, but he made himself look like a servant. See, one of the things that happens a lot of times when we serve other people, when we try to help other people, I still try to look like a master. I still try to look like a Lord. I try to look like I'm greater, mightier, better than you. And I say, oh, you poor thing, let me help you. Thought I was saying something wrong there for a second. But let me try to help you, because you're in a lowly state. And let me make sure you understand what a lowly state that you're in. You poor, pathetic little thing. You think Peter felt like a poor, pathetic little thing when God in the flesh washed his feet? Or do you think Peter felt exalted, appreciated, honored? Did he deserve any of it? Absolutely not. And yet that's what Jesus gave him. Would that we could serve one another that way. That is what our heart's desire is supposed to be. Jesus is symbolizing the utmost end of what love looks like. that he gave himself on the cross. Yes. But before any of that happened, he was equal with God. He emptied himself of all of that. He came as a man, as a servant, and was obedient to the point of death. And that is why God highly exalted him and gave him the name which is above every name, the name at which everyone is going to bow the knee to and confess with their lips. Everyone. And again, Jesus' example empties us of any kind of pride and arrogance that we might have. And that's why Jesus is telling them that there's something that is deeper here that you're missing. You remember in John 3, and again, John's writings are good at this. Back in John 3, he talks to Nicodemus about birth, about being born again. But he's not talking about the flesh. He's talking about the spirit. In John chapter 4, he talks to this woman at the well, and he starts talking about water. But he's not talking about water. He's talking about living water, the kind of water that you can drink and never thirst again. John chapter 6, he's talking about bread. But it's not talking about some physical bread from heaven again, but he's talking about himself being the bread of life. And that if you eat of that bread, you'll never hunger again. John does this over and over again. And here in John 13, I believe he's doing the same thing and trying to teach his disciples what the proper mindset is all about. Again, Philippians chapter 2, picking up at verse 1. Therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, if you understand the love that Christ has for you and the way in which you have this relationship with Christ, if there's any comfort of that love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind. Let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. We see that it is the way of Christ to learn his example, to have this particular mindset, that love is not self-centered. Love is not thinking that people need to pay me attention. You need to be more concerned about my cares and my wants and my desires. You need to be putting me first. That is not love. That's self-centeredness. Jesus is the one that extended the love. Jesus is the one that extended the service. And notice this as well. Peter wanted to change the way in which Jesus was going to serve him. And Jesus had to remind Peter, if you don't accept me serving you, you have no part in me. I think there's a very important lesson for us today about that. Jesus has extended to us all grace and mercy. You don't change the terms of it. But Jesus, I know you want to do this, but not just my feet, my head and everything, my hands, everything. Jesus says, I know how to serve you. Jesus says, I know how to serve you. You don't change that. The world's always about changing the way Jesus wants to serve us. But if we don't accept the way that Jesus serves us, we can't be saved. That's the lesson of John 13. That if you want to receive my salvation, then you have to be like me. I've given you an example. In verses 34 and 35 of John 13, he tells them, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you. That we, brethren, love one another to the end. To that final moment. To that time that we draw our last breath. And we do it to the utmost, not in word only, but in deed and in truth. By this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. When we talk about this, I think sometimes we become very one-sided, in that we think that people are going to know that we love one another because we like to hang out with each other. We like to be in one another's company. We like to have conversations. We hang around the building for a long time. Even when we go to gospel meetings, a group of us are there. We're usually the last ones to leave that building. We don't even belong there. And that is a great thing, brethren. It really is. But that is the symptom. The cure is that we actually love one another. And we will be by one another to the bitter end, be it life or be it death. And that we're going to do it to the utmost. That's what we're supposed to be. That's what Jesus wants us to be striving for. Galatians 5:13 says, through love we serve one another. In Hebrews 6 and verse 10, it reminds us that just as it was with Jesus, that God is not unjust to forget your work and labor of love. He exalted Jesus to his throne and gave him that high and holy name. God's not unjust to forget your work and your labor of love, which you have shown toward his name. Why do we do it? Just as it was with Jesus, we love one another and we understand our eternal relationship with our Father, just as it was here, in that you have ministered to the saints and do minister. It is one thing to reach for a towel and wash the feet of others. It's quite another to endure the scourging and the nails in the hands and the feet. Jesus loved to the end. He loved to the uttermost. So what Jesus says, blessed are you if you do this, because you know it. There are so many things that we do know that we should be about doing, but we do get distracted. There's a lot of things that get in the way. If we understand and really appreciate the love that we have for one another and the eternal relationship we have with God, being in fellowship with him, it removes those distractions. If there is something that's distracting you, look to those two things this week and see where the trouble lies, because it's going to be one of those two things. That's the example that Jesus set before us. The question I'm going to leave with you this morning is this, do you love like Jesus loved? That is a scary question, and one that hurts to even try to answer. It's one of those you kind of shirk away from because you don't want to answer that question. We appreciate things like this when it comes to the lady whose husband was missing in action, was actually dead for all of those years, for over 60 years. We appreciate that so much. Let's not look at this account in the life of Jesus and think that it's just about washing feet, because there's so much involved, so much more involved than just that. Love to tell this story to others, because others need to hear it. If you're subject to the invitation this morning, if you found that you are lacking in some area, if you've not yet obeyed the gospel and need to this morning so that you might be called a child of God, if you need help in any way whatsoever that we might help you to attain to those spiritual goals that you know you should have, whatever that need may be, please let us know as together we stand and sing this song to encourage.